So we're going to make a start now because it's 4 o'clock, and thank you all for signing up to this webinar. Scheduled to be the second of 3 webinars, but it actually is the first, given we had some technical difficulties last time. Just a couple of things to signpost. So the first is that the next webinar that we're holding will be on December the 10th. Sir David Carter will be presenting, and that will be on holding colleagues to account. And then the rearranged webinar will be on January the 12th, which is all about vision setting and creating alignment. In terms of how we're going to run this webinar, I'm going to hand over to David shortly to do his presentation. But you'll note that at the bottom of your screen, you should see a question and answer facility. If during the presentation you've got a question that you want to raise or a comment, then you're able to put that into the question and answer facility, and I'll be gathering those up as David presents, and we'll present those back to him at the back end of the presentation, so your question can be dealt with there and then. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Sir David Carter. He's well known to all of us in the Southwest. He's currently Executive Director for System Leadership at the Ambitions Institute, formerly the National Schools Commissioner and Southwest Regional Schools Commissioner. He's obviously been a MAT CEO and a head teacher, and has recently published a book, Leading Academy Trusts, Why Some Fail But Most Don't. Warmly recommended. So David, it's fantastic to have you on the conference. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that very warm welcome. And it is an absolute pleasure to work with you after what I'm sure has been a really busy day for you all in this slightly strange era that we're leading our schools in. So the 3 sessions that we are going to do, the one that we've got one coming up on December the 10th and then another one early in January, I think flow really well out of the theme for this evening. And for me, this is the crux of how effective leadership in the school sector really pays its way and delivers the kind of outcomes that we want. We work in a people industry, and we have the challenge of motivating people, creating structures in which people can flourish, and thinking about the kind of responsibilities we want people to take on board. But without a really well-structured development plan, and in my view, not just a development plan, but a talent management plan, then we're never going to be able to accelerate the improvement as fast as we want to. So I took that as my theme this evening, and I guess what I want to do is to share some practical ideas with you about some of the things that I've tried to do myself, both within the civil service and also within the Cabot Learning Federation when I was there, but also some of the really strong things I've seen around the country over the last sort of 5 years as well, where people are wrestling with this particular theme. And I don't think there's one right way to do it. I don't think there's a blueprint that says this is the one that we should all follow. I think it's very much dependent upon the stage of the improvement journey that a school or a group of schools might be on. But what I think is an absolute must-have is that there has to be somebody that really understands and is tasked with leading and making sure that this kind of talent culture is embedded in schools. So if we go on to the next slide, what I want to talk about here, I suppose, are the basically the anchors of what I'd like to do with you this evening. I'm very conscious that when you come onto a webinar like this, you'll want to share some of this thinking with the people in your teams who are not here this evening. That's great. Please do that. And so I'm going to give you a structure through which you can do it, and I'm sure you'll be able to access these slides and use them if that's helpful. But I want to do 3 things. I want to talk about what a talent management plan is, and how is that different to a CPD plan? How does that really work? The second question I want to explore is how we develop people professionally, but also at the same time take care of their well-being, because I think a really strong talent plan looks at both angles on that. It's not just helping people to be the best professional version of themselves, it's also making sure that they're fit and well to be able to be that professional version that we want them to be. And then my third question is about this impact, and how do we create a professional development culture that isn't just about development, it's actually about development for improvement. And I'm sure that will resonate with many of you in the way that you're thinking about the way that your roles are working today. So if I start with the next slide, I'm thinking very much here about schools that are part of collaborations, and one of the things that's becoming more and more obvious in Plymouth is that more schools are working more closely together than probably at any time I can remember in the recent past. And I spent a lot of time working with Plymouth schools when I was Regional Schools Commissioner in the Southwest. And it was still an area that I was very keen to explore with those RSEs who followed me when I was in the national role, about how do we do something remarkable for young people in Plymouth and the school sector in Plymouth. And I think one of the ideas that I've seen, which I think really helps with this, is this notion about how do we talk about people who work in collaborations being part of a broader faculty of education team. So if I'm leading a single school, my faculty of education are the people in my building. If I'm part of a multi-academy trust, then my faculty of education are the people that do the similar roles in that trust. So for example, if I'm leading a multi-academy trust and there are 5 secondary schools and half a dozen primary schools in there, then the faculty of maths education is everybody that we employ to teach maths. And when you start thinking on that kind of scale, you begin to think about the power of the resource that you have in front of you. And that's where these 4 bullet points, I think, begin to become quite relevant. So if the challenge is how you build the culture of being part of one team, even though your teams might be spread across multiple sites, then uniting them around the concept of actually we have this in common is a really important part of that. And if we get that right, then I think we begin to build this sense of teamness, as I've referred to it here, and being part of something bigger. So we stop worrying a bit less about how one individual school is performing in their Key Stage 2 SATs, or how one individual secondary school is doing in terms of its GCSE results in science, and think about how every child in the collaboration, and ultimately every child in the city, is being supported through the way that the adults and the professionals are collaborating together. And if you believe, as I do, in the phrase "every child matters," and if you've been around as long as I have, you might remember that in the final Labour government, before the coalition came in 2010, the overarching strategy that the Department for Education had in place was called exactly that: "Every child matters." And it wasn't just about the outcomes that we achieved at the end of key stages and national exam results and tests. It was about the whole principle of the team around the child and how that works. And I think that's a really important message for schools in Plymouth, because the children that you work with in some parts of the city, I don't think it's everywhere, but in some parts of the city, have some really big challenges that they face in their young lives. And the adult professionals, the educators, wrapping their arms around the city to ensure that every child gets what they need is a really important part of this principle. And I think it's also then how the schools and trusts unite to become more than the sum of their parts. So, I was working in a Midlands local authority talking about this very topic last week, and there were 37 secondary schools in the city, in this local authority. And the challenge was, how do 37 schools actually create the value of 50 secondary schools? And it comes on the back of how they work together and they share. And I'll talk about some of that as we go further forward. So if I cut to the chase, the main topic this evening is the next slide: building a talent strategy. Let me begin first of all by saying what I don't think it is. I don't think you can create a talent strategy managing by anecdote. And what I mean by that is that you'll have had the experience, you'll have either heard the conversation, or you may even been the recipient of the conversation, where somebody walks around your school and they're showing somebody around, and you're caught doing something really good in the moment, or conversely, something that's not very good in the moment. And as a result of it, that anecdote defines where you sit in the talent map. And we've got to challenge that, and we've got to think much more strategically and cohesively about what it means to build a talent management strategy in order to develop people. And that's what I want to talk about next. So if we go to the next slide, there's something for me about this relationship between specialism and the pedagogical skill acquisition to become a great teacher. And I've said many times that one of the real obstacles we have to overcome in our system is that we have in our language the language of the word outstanding. And we talk about outstanding teaching, and we talk about outstanding teachers. And given that I've now been in the profession since 1983, and I've been in leadership roles since 1995, I haven't yet met an outstanding teacher. If the definition of an outstanding teacher is every day, every lesson, every academic year, that just doesn't exist. For me, the outstanding teacher in your school, or maybe some of you this evening, are the people who are consistently good, are consistently thinking and challenging themselves about how they become better teachers. Not when you've got to the end of year 2 or year 3 and that's it, I'm now made. I've been through the process, I'm a teacher. You continue to learn about your teaching experience. When I was a head, I continued to teach GCSE music. When I went into Bristol, I taught GCSE business studies. The children in my GCSE classes saw me as their music or their business studies teacher. They didn't see me as the head. I still had to really think about my practice in order to teach to the best of my ability those young people who'd chosen those subjects. So for me, this is very much about ensuring that inexperienced teachers get the chance to teach within either their subject specialism in secondary, or in their year group in primary. The idea that you take somebody who's a novice teacher and they teach a 50% maths timetable because that's their subject, but they actually help out by teaching a little bit of RE or a bit of history or a bit of PSE is not the way to develop that level of specialism. And I think it's also quite important that teachers get the chance to experience teaching the same lessons to different groups. One of the things which I really like, and I think this is one of the things which I see more and more trusts and some teaching school alliances, but it's not exclusively MATs, is where there's a conscious plan that a teacher who's recruited teaches in one school in their NQT year, then gets an opportunity to teach in a different school in the trust in the second year. And I think that's really interesting because it's not about challenging whether your pedagogy is strong enough. It's about actually giving you the opportunity to test yourself in a different arena. Even if the makeup of the school is very similar, the opportunity to teach in different settings, I think, is a really powerful one. But I think that's also something that we should be thinking for very experienced teachers as well. And then the third one is a nod to the quality of coaching and mentoring that you can provide, ensuring that an inexperienced teacher has someone they can learn from and can talk to, I think is massively important in developing what I put across the bottom of the strapline there, that developing of teacher expertise. And so a couple of questions which I think are good ones to think about, and I don't necessarily think we need to resolve them here this afternoon, but questions that I would encourage you to take out of today and think about and reflect upon are these. Does the working environment support or hinder the drive to help teachers teach better? So if you think about the ingredients of what better teaching means, around coaching, around mentoring, around bespoke teacher development, around the space that they have. And I don't necessarily mean teaching a reduced timetable, but actually how you can see their timetable around having opportunities to see other people teach, having the opportunity to team teach with people, having the opportunity to go out of the school and see other people's practice. It's that really cohesive strategic thinking about the working environment that I'm referring to there. And then the second question is about the systems, the policies and the routines in place to support inexperienced teachers, and clearly support for classroom management and behaviour management would be part of that. And this is where I think the visibility of senior leaders and middle leaders is so important. There can't be anything worse than a new teacher 6 weeks into their teaching career faced with a really challenging class and feeling that they are completely on their own in dealing with that situation, and that there is no support available. And actually even worse, that if they requested that support, it would be seen as a weakness. So the culture of the organisation, as well as the systems and the policies and the practices, is a really important element to unite around supporting inexperienced teachers to address this whole point about subject specialism and confidence and becoming a better teacher. So what I wanted to do next was to think about 3 strands to the talent management plan. And the first one of those for me is about teacher recruitment. And yes, there is a challenge about teacher recruitment, and it would be really naive to suggest otherwise. And what we see in the education sector is that when there is a financial crisis, all of a sudden quite a lot of people from the city, I'm thinking of people who are working in the banking and the finance industries, suddenly realize they've got a moral purpose and actually they want to go become teachers. And we might be about to see some of that happening going forward. particularly in the next 2 to 3 years. But teacher recruitment is in a situation where there are more people at the moment requiring teachers than there are teachers on the market. So if you're a young person with a degree and a postgraduate teaching qualification looking for your first teaching post for this coming September, actually you have a fair amount of choice about where you might go to work. And so we need to think, I think, really, really cohesively about how we get the right messages out about our schools and about our trusts, and in the case this afternoon, particularly about what it means to be working in your great city. So I think there's number one is about what is the unique feature about working in your school or your trust. In a business parlance, we might call that the unique selling point, the USP. But a teaching jobs, generally speaking, sound very familiar, in that you go to a building, you have a classroom, and children come to your classroom for you to teach them. But as you know, the culture of schools is very, very different. Those of you that have worked in more than one school will know exactly what I mean. And you'll be very lucky if your career sees you go through maybe half a dozen schools where actually the culture was absolutely in tune with your beliefs. So we need to think very hard to think about the unique feature about working in your school, about working in your team, and being under your leadership. I think those are really important questions to ask. I think it's also a key point for us to think about is how we think about our own internal labour market, by which I mean the city of Plymouth. So, what does it mean to teach for Plymouth? That's a phrase which we've used in other cities in the UK. It came out of some of the George Bush and the Barack Obama thinking in the States about education. But what does it mean to teach for Plymouth communities? What does it mean to teach in your city? Why is it different teaching in Plymouth to teaching in Bristol or teaching in Gloucester or teaching in the Midlands? What's unique about that? How powerful is your word of mouth in terms of using your existing staff to identify external talent that you might want to hire? Because that works in the negative as well. If people have family members or friends of other families who are all looking to think about a career in teaching, and the message on the street is that this is a really rubbish school to work in, you don't want to go there, the kids are climbing out the windows, they're throwing chairs around the corridors, then that will go across the community. And it's really damaging and really hard to overturn that reputation. So how do people that already are employed by your organizations really talk positively about what it's like to be part of your school community? And I think this whole notion of development and talent management is a really part of that. For those of you that are working in maybe senior leadership positions where you've been part of the selection process for people to come and work, think as hard about the people that were unsuccessful as the people that got the job. I think the way in which we give feedback that's really purposeful, the worst feedback to tell somebody is you did really well, but you were just beaten by a better candidate on the same day. Those people can do nothing with that feedback. And the reality is that's probably not the case. There will be a reason why they weren't the best candidate. Be brave enough to tell them what that's going to be, because if you have that relationship with those unsuccessful candidates, maybe they'll come and work for you in the future. And if they don't, they'll talk about the process and talk about how valuable the feedback was. And then my point on the last bullet is the one I mentioned earlier about, is it possible for an NQT to experience a different school in year 2 to year 1? And whilst I think it's easier in a trust where people are employed by the same group, I don't think it's impossible to do it elsewhere. If that was something that people felt was a really interesting thing. So chapter 1 of the talent management plan I want to talk about is about teacher recruitment. Chapter 2 would be about the next slide, which is about the flip side of that, I guess, which is improving teacher retention. And we talk about recruitment and retention as if there's an inevitability about both. And of course there is. People move on, people retire, people get promotions, and we need to replace them. But the reason why we've had a recruitment challenge in recent times is that far too many young people have left the profession. And in primary, the data tells us there's a spike at the end of year 4. And in secondary, the spike comes at the end of year 3. And it very literally is. If you look at the graphs that the Workforce Centres puts out, there's a trickle in year 1, a bit more in year 2, and the graph climbs. But in year 3 and year 4, in those phases, it's quite dramatic. And I think these are some of the reasons behind that. I'm not speculating these. These are part of the research that's been done. And these things are in our power to do something about it. If we're minded to. So the first reason why people talk about leaving is that the newer teachers joining the career pathway of teaching are the ones that often leave first. And how often do we put their needs first? So very simple things like the kind of timetable that they have, or the room allocation that they have. I've seen too many examples over the years where the experienced teacher believes that the classroom belongs to them. How dare anybody suggest that they may have to teach in 3 or 4 different rooms over the course of the week? And yet the consequence of that is it's the new teacher that ends up having to pick up their plastic box of books and walk down the corridor, and then run the risk that they arrive late to the lesson and the class that they've already got a difficult relationship with are already in the classroom waiting for them. These are really simple tricks and simple strategies that we can think differently. How does the induction program work? Is it a source of support or an unwelcome demand on people's time? What are the best elements of it? How do we know that it's working? Why do we do the same induction program year on year, repeating many of the same things that we put into the calendar when actually the group are different, the cohort is different? What's the structured career pathway that enables the initial teacher trainee and the newly qualified teacher to see how the next 10 years might map out? What kind of opportunities are you going to promise them in terms of development and in terms of career pathways? And of course, that's dependent upon how well they perform and their own development, their aptitude for that kind of responsibility and increasing that responsibility. But when do we paint the picture that talks about what that would happen? Because if the crux comes around year 3 and year 4, where people start thinking about leaving, then actually that's the point that we know we need to get people over that hurdle. Because the data says that once you get to year 5 and year 6, the people staying for the next 15 to 20 years is a much greater proportion of that. So there's something about how we get that message right. The access that new teachers have to coaches and mentors, I've mentioned that one. But also that culture that senior leaders create that enables teachers to become great teachers. And that is about support. It is about visibility. It is about if you're responsible for a part of the school or a curriculum area, knowing where are the likely flashpoints for a new teacher with certain classes, and how do you make sure that you're available? How do you make sure that you just look in around the classroom door and make sure they're okay? It's as simple as that sometimes, just to make sure that people feel that they've got support if they need it. And all of these things and many other things go into that second chapter for me about how do we improve teacher retention. The third chapter would be around teacher motivation. And I think this flows out of the first 2 that I've just mentioned. And I asked the question deliberately here about, does the performance management system motivate and inspire teachers to want to improve, or does it feel a little bit checklisty? What's the relationship between performance management and development, and how do teachers know what they've got to do in order to get a favorable response at the end of the year? The second one is about feedback, which relates to that, is does the feedback help teachers work out whether they're getting better or not? Whatever the mechanism would be, how do people make sense of the feedback and be able to pick it up and deal with it and become better teachers in terms of their response? And my point, the third one, is similar to the point I made about the feedback to unsuccessful candidates. How do we tell people the truth about their performance without decimating them, without shattering their confidence, without making them feel inadequate? How do we help people with that? And what's our technique for delivering that feedback, and then picking people up so that they work with it and they improve as a result of it? I think there's a fourth one, which I think is interesting around the way that the Plymouth Strategy is evolving, which is about bringing people together to help them share. And how do you enable people to work with other teachers from other schools? How do we commission teachers to think about new ways of working that would work not only in their own setting, but beyond that as well? And then the last one is something I've seen a couple of times in some trusts when a group of teachers propose doing something different, but they are disregarded because they've not been teaching long enough. I call this the carriage clock syndrome, that says we only listen to you when you've got 10 years experience, where actually some of the most innovative thinking comes from the newest members of the profession, because they haven't been around the clock long enough to say, well, we tried that 5 years ago and it didn't work then. These people are fresh to the profession, they've got ideas and they want to be listened to. And this is a part of the way in which we think about their own motivation. And then the fourth chapter, if I can sort of use that phrase, is a big one, which is about improving teacher development. And I wasn't this evening going to get into the real detail of CPD because it'll be very unique to different contexts. But I do want to talk very, very briefly, if I can, about what I think the four headings are around this, and the four challenges that I think have to be overcome in order to develop great CPD programs. The first one, I think, is the top left-hand corner one about who owns the development plan for each teacher. In the sense that the answer for me is absolutely about the individual. The individual teacher has to own their own development plan. They have to take some responsibility for their own personal development. That can't always be about what other people provide for them. But I think there is a joint ownership here, that recognizing that the development is very personal, it's very individual, and it develops over time. And you have to have the same conversation with a year one teacher who's just come into the profession, I think, as you do as somebody who's in their 25th year about the development that they need. That then takes us into the top right-hand corner about how bespoke is teacher development in your school. I mean, we are a million miles away now from the way that we used to do this probably 10 years ago or more, where, you know, people would sit in a school hall on a Monday evening from 4 till 5:30 having inset done to them, when actually some of the people listening should have been leading the inset, let alone being the recipients of it. So I think we've moved on dramatically from there, but there's still quite a long way to go in terms of how we source great development for people. If that one teacher has that one unique need that nobody else needs, how do we do that? I think in the bottom left-hand corner, this relationship between working with others and working as an isolated practitioner. So how do we team teach? How do we create purposeful lesson observations so that we're looking at very specific things? I don't think teachers need to watch each other teach for an hour. Sometimes the first 10 minutes or the last 10 minutes of a lesson is a really valuable exercise. And if I was the head of that department, or I was an assistant principal or a deputy head, or even the head for that matter, I think I probably did this in my own headship, and I know that somebody wants to go and watch the last 10 minutes of somebody, I'll go and cover the lesson for 10 minutes just to make sure they get the opportunity to do that. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, I think is quite a big issue, but I think it's an exciting one, which is that research and evidence culture in the school. You know, we talk an awful lot about being evidence rich and using data to inform practice, but I don't think it's necessarily as big as that. I think it's about encouraging teachers to be curious, to want to know what's happening in somebody else's lesson in the same subject, or somebody's lesson in a primary year group that's the same year group. Or if I'm a year 6 teacher, let's go and look at what a really great phonics lesson in early years looks like. Or I'm a year 6 teacher, I'm really curious to know what a Key Stage 3 English lesson looks like from the children I'm teaching today. Let me go and see if I can see one. I think it's that curiosity that really engages people and links into that motivation piece that I mentioned a moment ago. I wanted to just talk a little bit about a couple of other issues. And so the next slide talks about workload, because I think a talent management strategy really has to grip this and have a look at it. And so I thought I'd start with a little bit of data for you. The most recently published teacher workload survey from the DFE came out in 2019. And the survey in 2019 talked about primary teachers working 49.5 hours in 2019, which is a reduction from 2016 from 54.4 hours. So what's that, just under 5 hours? So that's progress, that's good. Secondary teachers, 49.1 hours a week in 2019 from 53.3 in 2016. But the question I kind of want to ask is that both in primary and in secondary, if we assume that the number of hours of contact time that a teacher is spending in front of a class is probably somewhere between 20 and 22, 23 hours. What are the other 30 hours being used for? Because actually, if I teach 23 hours a week in a secondary school, there are 26 hours, according to this data, where I'm doing other things. Now, let's not be naive. I can't do my job on 23 hours a week. There's an expectation that I'm well prepared. There's an expectation that I'm going to mark and assess children's work, and I'm going to give kids feedback. So there is a high degree of work that needs to happen outside of the classroom. But it seems to me that even at 49 hours for primary and secondary, that's still disproportionate. And so I want to throw out a challenge, I suppose, here is, what's a realistic target by the end of the academic year 21-22? And I'm deliberately going forward 12 months because I think this year is so unusual and so unpredictable. I think it would be hard to define that. But if we assume that things are beginning to go back to what we recognise as a normal school life in September 21, what does that realistic progress look like? Is it about taking it down by 2022 to say 45 hours, which would be actually a reduction of 10 hours in 6 years, which is progress, because this is difficult stuff. This is not easy to do. And so a talent management strategy is very much for me about making sure that people are well and mentally healthy to be able to do their job really well. And workload is a big driver around that. And in terms of how we might approach it, I think you have to ask 6 questions, and my next slide asks them. So when I've worked with multi-academy trusts on their teacher workload plans as part of their talent strategy, these are the questions that I start with. And they're pretty obvious. If I'd said to you, devise a questionnaire around teacher workload, you'd have come up with these yourselves. But these are the ones that I use most frequently. The only change is the first one, because this is obviously much more relevant, I think, now, which is how much use of digital technology is being made to reduce face-to-face information sharing. And of course, what's happened as a resolution to the challenge we face is that more and more of the interactions where I think information is being shared are happening on Zoom or on Teams. And of course, you can record those conversations, so it enables people to be able to get that information shared with them when they choose to see it. They don't have to go and meet in a physical space at the end of a school working day. Now that hour that you'd be in that staff meeting for may not take an hour to do that information sharing on a Zoom call. So I think there's a good question around that, but I think that's also about training as well, and how much of the training could be done when teachers choose to do that training in an evening or a weekend, if they want to do that, in order to go home from school earlier and go for a swim or go to the gym or go for a run. The second one is about the policy on providing feedback to children, which I guess what I mean probably subliminally here is marking. What is the marking policy? How much of the marking is still what I used to call tick and flick? How much of the marking is done to be able to demonstrate to parents that there's a lot of red pen in my child's book, therefore this is a great school? And how do we help educate both our parents and our colleagues that there are different ways now to provide that feedback to children? The third one is take a look at your school calendar and look at the pinch points. How many weeks can a school cope with school concerts, inset and staff meetings, and perhaps parent consultation evenings coming in the same week? And how do we think about the rhythm of the calendar? That if you do have a week like that, then perhaps the week before or the week after is very different. How many teacher data inputs are duplicated over the year? How many times do particularly multi-academy trusts do you as leaders get asked for the same data by different people in ever so slightly different formats, which means you can't just press send, you have to recalibrate that data spreadsheet. How often do you take a spot check on the working hours in an academic year? So my previous slide talked about where we were in 2019, and I threw out a challenge about where you might be in 18 months' time. But you can't leave that to the end of the year. You can't say, okay, our hope is it'll be down to 45 hours, and in July 2022, we'll test it. I think you have to identify a research group and a control group of staff that you ask the same questions to at the same time. And some of those people, perhaps in your research group, are very much thinking about working differently. And the other people you haven't asked to do anything differently, so you can compare and contrast the impact of that. And on my sixth question is about the responsibility of governance in this. The trustees of a multi-academy trust or the local school governing body in whatever setting you are, they have a responsibility here to take the oversight of workload very seriously. And I think they need to go as far as identifying somebody on their board of governors or their board of trustees who is going to ask those questions and who is going to be particularly interested in the workload challenge that we face. And if you think about all of that, then you end up, I think, with quite a cohesive end-to-end talent management framework that enables you to think about where you're going to be. So if that's the plan, then how do we make some of that happen? So on the next slide, I wanted to take a moment to talk about what I've seen some of the most effective schools and trusts do in this area. And in a way, this is some of the exemplification of some of the ideas I've just shared with you. And I won't read all of this to you because it's pretty evident that some of these things are there. But the first bullet point is pretty important. I think you can't underestimate both the power and the security for teachers of feeling they're part of a wider network of professional teachers. So in a one-form entry primary school where you're the only teacher of year 3, who do you plan year 3 work with if you're in a single school? If you're a teacher of RE in a secondary school, you're often a department of 1 or maybe 1.5 if you're lucky. My own subject, music, would be in the same category. So how do you build a network of people who are not in the same building but have the same professional background and teach the same subject or the same year group to enable them to feel that security being part of something bigger? I think there's something also in my third bullet point on the left there about how we enable teachers to be both influenced and by others and to learn from them, but also to contribute to that. So on the top right hand corner there, that professional opportunity to be part of co-constructing curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. And if we get this right about the workload reduction ideas I've talked about, you immediately create capacity for people to be able to think out of the box and think differently. And that co-construction point I've made, I think, is the antidote to replication, reproduction, and the duplication of effort. If you work in a school, or even in a collaboration where the sense is the only person who can prepare lessons for the children I teach is me, and that I have nothing to learn from everybody else, then there's going to be a workload problem. I don't buy into the notion that teaching maths is different in Sheffield to teaching maths in Cornwall. The input and the curriculum thinking must by definition be the same. Possibly the context of how you deliver it might be, but actually great thinking about how a maths curriculum is formed, great thinking about how we think differently about behavior management or how we think about assessment. There are some important things there which are actually uniform to most of the school sector. And that duplication I've referred to there is where I think some of the drive comes from, where we've been at 54 hours a week and now it's down to 49. How are we going to make even more impact upon that one? The next slide, I'll take a moment to explain it, although I don't think it's complex. But in one of my earlier points, I talked about how do you give people an insight into what the next 10 years might look like. So, on the day that you've got a group of interview candidates looking for their first teaching post, there'll be newly qualified teachers in the autumn. How do we give them the impression that actually there is a plan? And I like this pyramid idea, and I used to drive this pyramid quite hard when I was working in Cabot. Because retaining teachers in Bristol was quite difficult at the time. And at the base of the pyramid is that deliberate practice of developing and honing your teaching skills and pedagogies with different classes. And that's a really important part of the element. It's about the real focus upon me deliberately practicing my pedagogical skills to become a really competent teacher. And I think that probably takes at least the first 2 years. But the reason why I like the pyramid structure is it never goes away. So even if you get to year 10, year 11, year 12 in your career, you're still having to deliberately practice your teaching techniques. Those of you that are in leadership roles where you teach slightly less than you did when you started teaching, you still have a responsibility to teach the best of your ability. And that base of the pyramid is still relevant. The second part of this journey, I think, is about how you use your confidence and ability to start to impact on other classrooms and teachers. So maybe around year 3, year 4, you're asking those teachers as they enter that phase of their career to mentor NQTs or to mentor ITT students. But they're already thinking about how they're giving something back to help the people that are coming behind them to become really confident teachers. The third layer of the pyramid, perhaps around year 5, year 6, maybe before, maybe later, but certainly around that period, is how do you get a group of people together who've been teaching for roughly the same period of time and commission them to come up with new ways of working, new practice, using evidence and research to think differently about pedagogy. And that's a huge responsibility because you really want that to make a difference. But the people teaching the largest contact ratio are probably the people best placed to do that work, not people who are teaching less and less. The fourth phase is that these teachers, having been through these different stages of the pyramid, now start to think about taking responsibility for the outcomes of children beyond their own teaching timetables. So whether it's a middle leadership role by leading a team or a phase in primary or a subject in secondary, or even working across a group of schools, helps you prepare the way for the final link in the chain around about year 8, year 9 perhaps, where you're now leading learning perhaps as an assistant principal, or not even necessarily in a senior leadership role, but actually as a great teacher, you are now given a really substantive role to improve the quality of teaching across a group of schools. And that won't be for everybody. There won't be everybody that you recruit as an NQT that will be able to make this journey. But I think the idea that the recipient knows that here is a plan, there is a plan to which you've thought about my development and my career pathway, just enable us to think differently about the structure rather than going from year to year to year and then suddenly realizing that at the end of year 4, one of our most highly regarded secondary practitioners has decided to go and take a year out and they won't come back. So that's what I call my development pyramid. The last couple of slides begin to think a little bit about capacity here. Because at the moment, I haven't talked about this, and there is a cost to everything I'm talking about here. But the point I want to make is that the cost isn't purely a financial one. So the capacity pyramid I'm describing to you here has 3 corners to it. So there is a financial cost at the top of the pyramid. There's a cost to training. There is a cost to releasing teachers to do extra work. There is a cost to getting a group of year 4 or year 5 teachers to come together and think differently about a piece of curriculum design. But actually, on the basis that as a leader, you can't spend the same pound twice, you have to think really hard about what are you going to stop paying for in order to invest in talent. And how are we going to divert resource to making sure that we get this right and that we start thinking about talent coming from the classrooms up in our organizations and not from our planning positions down. So financial cost is the first part of it. In the bottom right-hand corner, there is a cost in terms of time that is needed to build the capacity. And this is something we have more influence over, for example, because actually, whilst there is a limited amount of flexibility around the financial spend, because budgets are what they are, and whilst, of course, you'd be right to tell me that there's only 24 hours in a day, how you choose to ask people to spend their time, that is within the gift of leadership. And I think that's where there's some really interesting questions about what we want people to do in terms of their time, whether we ask people to be thinking differently within the working day about how they spend their time, how we ask them to think differently about that period towards the end of the day, 3 until 4:30, that kind of period. How do we want people to do that? That's a really important conversation. And then on the far left-hand side is the talent and intellectual development cost, which is basically what the whole presentation so far has been about. But when you break down capacity into those 3 components, it begins to feel doable and manageable, because you don't need to enact all 3 to enable to unleash teacher talent. You just need to be conscious that there is a cost, and the cost is spread out in terms of finance, in terms of time, and in terms of talent development. And when you see it through that lens, I think some of this becomes a bit easier. On the next slide is a little bit about transmission of practice. So when we see things working really well, how do we share it? How do we disseminate it? We have to be really careful here, I think, that we don't fall into the trap of using the phrase best practice. I try to resist doing that and remind myself to use the phrase effective practice. Because the problem I have, I think, with best practice is that best practice in your classroom isn't automatically going to be best practice in mine, because you understand it and you conceived it and you developed it. And you went through the pain of honing it and making it really strong. And you can't just give it to me and expect me to implement it in the same way. So the ownership of that practice exchange is really important. We have to think about that. But one of the things I've seen happen many times is that if you're the person who's created that really strong practice, and the idea is that I adopt it in my classroom, the act and the process of reflecting on the practice to explain it to me often makes the original practice even better, because you've tested it by how can I explain it to somebody who's not seen it before, who actually is really curious about it. And the act of explaining it to me makes you reflect on how you could do it even better. And these are the 4 S's that I see happening in collaborations. There's an S for sharing, which is a very obvious one, and that's what I've just described around the effective practice. How do we actually share that? How do we make something feel accessible? The second S is around swaps. And what I mean by that is that you get people who are doing similar jobs in different settings. They teach the same subject, or they teach the same year group, or they're business managers, or they're librarians, or they're behavior assistants, whatever the role might be. And you give them the opportunity to swap jobs for maybe half a term. And they apply to do that exchange together. and then they move into their separate roles together. And I think that's a really interesting challenge around how you've identified the talent and you've moved it around the organization to deepen it. I think the third S is around secondment, and how you use the skills that you might have in one individual in one part of the city to help people improve something where there's a skills gap elsewhere. And I think that works easier in a trust than it does in an individual school. But if the collaborative gene of the leaders in Plymouth is developing in the way that I've been told it is, then actually that suddenly becomes a real potential across the city, because it's something which gives you a chance to think about where the real need is and how you resolve some of the need for the benefit of the children in the city. And then the fourth S is the substantive new role word about, jobs and opportunities that come up. If there is a culture of transformation and transformation through talent management in Plymouth, then actually the movement between schools and between trusts should be easier, because people will be on a similar page in terms of what they're trying to develop. And then to bring it to a close, my last but one slide, the next one, says, I think these are the things that I see leaders do. So there's an element of summary here rather than throwing some new ideas at you, but I think they work in this way. I think that the way in which the values and beliefs about how schools and trusts are being led is really well defined, and it comes from that place about every child matters, but every adult matters, and what you believe about the right of individuals to being developed and being taken care of, hence the well-being point I made earlier. The second idea about feeling part of something that's bigger than the individual team, that faculty of education, I think is quite powerful. The strategy around workforce talent that I've talked about is embedded within that. I think the relationship between talent management and school improvement, for me, is very, very strong, in terms of the people that are actually going to deliver the improvement are the people in our schools. So therefore, if we develop them, there should be a flow through into improving standards as well. But I sometimes think you have to make that connection. I think you have to tell people and write it into your strategic plans that actually there is a clear connection between talent and improvement. And then the fifth one is about, so when you see that really strong practice, how are you going to transmit it? How do you identify it? How do you move it across the city, between schools, between classrooms? And those are some of the really good challenges. And then I'll finish with the final slide, which is kind of where I think we are at the moment in terms of this. And I'm really happy to open this up and engage in a dialogue with you about this. But one of the things that I would encourage you to do after today is to look at these 5 questions and really challenge yourself to think about how you do this. And maybe how you do it differently. So the question number 1 is about the identification of talent. How do you do that? How do you know who your talent pool is? And how do you know where there are relative weaknesses and how you improve those people? What do you do with that information when you've got it? Do you subscribe to that notion of being part of a bigger faculty of education within the talent plan? It's not a deal breaker. I don't think you have to do that, but it's a neat way of thinking about the wider team. How do you take the plan from being a strategy and a policy into doing something that's really cohesive and makes a difference in classrooms? And then my 5th question, which is always a good one to end with, is, well, when you've done all of that, how do you know it's working? So that was a bit of a helter-skelter drive through some of that thinking, but I hope there's enough in there to really inspire you and make you think. And Tony, I'm happy to come off the slides now and engage in a dialogue.
Brilliant. So Krista will stop sharing her screen, and you should be able to see us. And I'm looking at the question and answer facility, and at the moment there aren't any questions, and I'm just assuming that that's because you're concentrating on the content. So feel free to use that facility to ask any questions. I can, one from me, David, that I think will be close to your heart really, is you're a new head teacher in a school, or just an experienced head teacher in a school. What are you actually looking at what are you looking for practically that gives you a sense that this is a future leader? So what are the things that would indicate to you that this person was worth investing in because you're seeing potential in them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of my answer is that if you're a new leader, a new head, for example, or a new deputy or a new assistant head, I don't think you start with a strategy. I think you start by spending an awful lot of time walking around your school and seeing as many people as possible. I don't mean observing them formally. I mean the power of the drop-in, the conversations on the hoof, putting your head around the door of classrooms to see what's happening, taking the climate, if you like, taking the temperature of the school. I think that's where that begins from. But I think in terms of that talent identification of future leaders, I think there are a couple of things that that I would say are observable. The danger is that if the points I'm about to say are not observable, it doesn't mean they're not a potential leader. So I think it has to be really diluted around a broad range of indicators. But I think there is something about the way in which it's manifestly obvious that that the individual that we are looking to identify puts children first. There's a very strong culture of children coming at the forefront of all the decision making in that person's team and in that person's classroom. I think that's a really important starting point. I think there is also a capability element here about knowing how to make a difference. So if that particular embryonic leader is given a challenge as a middle leader, for example, to close the disadvantage gap, it's clearly they've got a point of view about how that might happen, and that they're willing to experiment and to try ideas out and use the evidence and the research they've acquired and they've read about to try and do that. So for me, I think people who are really broad thinkers, curious about what people have written, read blogs, maybe write blogs, look at some of the EEF stuff that's come out, look at some of the stuff that's published by Ambition and Teach First. That curiosity is quite interesting, because I think that's how you feed yourself around that. I think there's something about communication as well, about how well does that potential leader take people on a journey with them and inspire them, so that the inspiration comes from not just wanting to follow them, but from understanding what their role is. Have you explained to me what you expect of me? And that kind of conversation. And then I think my fourth C is probably around compassion. And recognizing as a leader that we are leading human beings, and the people in our teams, the people on the call this evening, your parents, your sons and daughters, your husbands and wives, your boyfriends and girlfriends, and sometimes stuff happens in life that actually has to be taken care of before we can think about our professional responsibilities. And the compassionate leader recognizes that great teachers and great leaders are adults with things going on in their lives as well. And are wanting to help out in order to help them become that great professional version of themselves when whatever thing they're dealing with has passed. If you think about the challenges that we face right now in terms of keeping our families safe and making sure that our loved ones are taken care of, that's been really emphasized in the last 8 months. And for some people, that's been very difficult, because there have been some really difficult things to deal with. Yet we expect them to turn up and be a great professional. And for me, the compassionate leader understands that and recognizes and cuts people some slack when they need to, but know they'll get the return on that, because people will work for them and follow them because how they've been treated.
And how early do you think you talk about novice teachers, but someone in their sort of first year, how early can they start thinking about leadership? They're honing their practice. It's their subject specialism that's important, but they don't get taught leadership. How early can you start doing that in schools? And I know you in the past you've had some models where actually A-level students were thinking about kind of leadership in that respect.
Yeah. So I don't think leadership is defined by age and experience. I think context comes into it. I was lucky enough to get my first headship when I was 36. I hadn't been teaching that long, and I was still making mistakes when I was 50. So I think the idea that you are suddenly created as this leader on a certain date, and you have a job title in an office, and all of a sudden there you are, you're made, you're done. I think that's nonsense. I think it's about that continuous learning process that you go on. But I think your question is a really good one, because I think leaders exist in our schools at many different levels without necessarily having a formal leadership responsibility. So I think that novice teacher we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, who makes a decision about, they've arrived at their lesson, for example, and the class has already gone into the room and says, actually, out you come. I want to talk to you before you start my lesson, I think is making a leadership decision. Okay, you could argue it's a classroom management decision. I think it's a leadership decision, because what they're saying is, right, I need you to enter my classroom on my terms, not just because you arrived before I did, because I was having to walk from the other side of the school. I think that's a leadership decision. I think it's a leadership decision about the teacher 6 months in who chooses to challenge a child about a piece of behavior or a piece of uniform when 3 more experienced adults walk past the child and ignored them. And of course, that young teacher is going to get the volley of abuse from the child because 3 more people, well, they didn't tell me. Why are you telling me? That's a leadership decision. So I think leadership is something which is inherent in the way that we work as a people industry. And I think what we then have to do is to take that embryonic leader, and through a combination of coaching, certainly a combination of role modeling. I think role modeling is very important, and a degree of formal development in the way that some of the best leadership programs do, enables people to take that germ of a leader and grow them into something great.
And I mean, we're in danger of this just being a conversation between you and me, because I still haven't got any questions up. But one of the things I'm really interested in is the relationship, David, between, a head teacher's leadership style and their senior team's leadership style, and the culture that creates in an organization. So for instance, if you are deliberately distributed in your leadership style, what does that mean, and how does that facilitate the growth of leaders versus a more autocratic leadership style? I know it's late.
That's a good question at the end of a long day. So I think my answer to that is I think leadership styles are more relevant in this day and age when we talk about the team leadership style. Because I think one of the things that we try to do when we're building leadership teams is we try to find, I don't think everyone does this, but I think effective teams are made up of people who are different to us. So I think there is a really good exercise in creating leadership teams of people who put a little bit of grit in the oyster, who put a little bit of that creative challenge into it. So I think when you think about the leadership characteristics that individuals might have, I think what you want to do is you want to try to create a leadership team that has all of those characteristics within it, but they probably wouldn't all be in the individual. And that's how I think you create opportunities for people who are different. So if you've got an experienced team who together, like I've got 100 years of experience between 6 people, then actually having somebody that's quite new to the profession is quite a good challenge to put into that team, because they'll ask the so-called stupid question because they weren't around 20 years ago. They're new to it. So I think the leadership style question is an interesting one, and I think it's about how you build teams around you that do two things really, that are have the individual capability, but where the sum of the parts is quantified, because it's a really powerful team. And I think there's something about the intelligences that make up leadership teams, which is, I think there are 2 of them really. I think there's what I call operational intelligence, which is, if I just cut to the chase, is knowing stuff. That you've got enough people around the leadership team who know how to improve behavior, how to improve teaching, how to ensure that assessment is moderated fairly and accurately. There's some technical stuff about how we lead our schools that you need people to have that body of knowledge and have experienced it. But operational intelligence without the emotional intelligence, I think, means that you get a really dry experience, which is the strategy is really strong and looks great on paper, but nobody ever implements it, because the emotionally intelligent leadership team is able to translate a plan into individual classrooms and make really clear to people how they enact it. And so if you think about the 2 things I've said there, the leadership team as a composite of its parts is where I think we're trying to get to. So the high performing teams are made up of different characteristics and different types of people, but also then the individuals have got the operational and the emotional intelligence to take a new idea and a new strategy and explain to people their part in it, and make sure that they understand how they're going to have to behave differently and what the training might be needed to help them behave differently. I think when you've got that, you've got a sweet spot beginning to emerge.
So I'm going to ask you one more question before we kind of wrap up. So in our leadership learning days, because we're not far off the same age, we were listening to people like Professor Alma Harris on distributed leadership, David Hargreaves, Andy Hargreaves, David Hopkins, all those academics. If there was one leadership piece of reading that you've seen and read recently that you would recommend colleagues to read, to learn about current thinking around leadership, what would it be?
Okay, I'm going to give you three, if I may. The first is by Kotter, Kotter, on leading change. If you need to understand a template for how you cohesively lead a piece of change and how you manage change, he's got a brilliant template for that, and it's one that I came across. I can't remember how long, over 20 years ago, and I've modified it and used it in different ways. But I think Kotter's change theory is a really interesting one to look at. If you want to understand how did we get to where we are today, Steve Mumby's book that came out about a year ago. When he talks about it's about leadership, it's about his experience, but it's about the journey from both his career, but also through the advent of the National College and the demise of the National College and how the system changed around it. And the third one is, you all need to read this. This is a brilliant book. 40% off on Black Friday in John Catt.
Okay, David, thank you very, very much indeed. I was actually going to promote your book right at the end, but you've done it for me.
Thank you.
So, colleagues, thank you so much for joining us. David, thank you for your presentation. There is going to be a recording of this webinar so that you're able to access it out of time. I probably should have checked if you're all right with that, David, but I'm sure you are.
No, you can't. No, absolutely not. No. Yeah, of course you can.
We will also send the slides around. So,
and I meant what I said about that. If the slides are useful to you, please use them. I'm not precious about that. They don't belong to me. You know, if you want to use them, just do what you like with them. But if it means that you can share this thinking with more people, then that's a result.
Yeah, and so the slides obviously provide you with a basis for having a leadership conversation about what a talent management strategy might look for your institution. And it was remiss of me, but I should thank the Ambitions Institute, who are sponsoring Sir David's time today for this piece of work. So we're very grateful. And if you haven't already signed up for the next session on December the 10th, which is all about holding colleagues to account, then I would warmly recommend that you do that. Other than that, thank you very much for attending, and we wish you all safe journeys home. Thank you very much.